I think we should start. And I'd like to welcome everybody to the first meeting of our new academic year, and a particular welcome to our online audience who are still filtering in on Zoom. Welcome to you. Could I ask the online audience to mute themselves during the lecture, please, and to turn off your cameras just to preserve the bandwidth on Zoom. There'll be an opportunity for questions to be asked later on. In fact, today we, as I'll say in due course, we have 3 presentations, and I think it will be easiest if we have all the questions at the end after all 3 presentations. But for those of you online, if you could, you're welcome to ask questions using the chat function on Zoom, and you could do that during the talks if that's easier. But those of you in the room, please reserve your questions until the end. Now, before I introduce our 3 speakers this evening, I'd like to ask the Secretary to read the minutes of the last meeting.
The 7th meeting of the 131st season took place at the Society of Antiquaries, Burlington House, Piccadilly, London, and online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 21st of May. Mr. Richard Linenthal, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, the President introduced Dr. Geoffrey Day, who delivered the 2024 Graham Pollard Memorial Lecture entitled The Preservation and Recycling of Waste Printed Sheets in the 18th Century Book Trade. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part. President, Mr. Keith Adams, Mr. Christopher Edwards, Mr. Giles Mandelbrot, Mr. Anthony Davis, Professor Nicholas Pickwoad, Miss Yvonne Lewis, Professor Tony Edwards, Dr. Amélie Jonquois, and Dr. James Willoughby. The President thanked Dr. Day warmly for his paper.
Thank you. Is it your wish that I sign these minutes? Thank you. Thank you. Now, it's a particular pleasure to introduce our 3 speakers this evening. A particular pleasure because we open this new academic year with a panel of 3 speakers whose work has been supported by the Society's fellowships and bursaries. As I'm sure all, or at least most of you know, the Society, alongside its publications and its lecture program, the Bibliographical Society should rightly take some pride in the breadth of its financial support for bibliographical research. Every year we give 7 or 8 major awards and usually more than 30 smaller awards to support research in all branches of bibliography and the history of the book. And the 3 speakers this evening were all supported through grants made earlier this year. And the first who I shall introduce is Anna Lanfranchi, who's a teaching fellow in translation and transcultural studies at the University of Warwick. She previously taught at Manchester, where she completed her PhD, which led to her recent book on translations and copyrights in the Italian book trade in the first half of the 20th century, which is published in the Routledge series New Directions in Book History. And that book investigates the legal status of translated texts in post-unification Italy and the negotiation of translation rights. Earlier this year, Anna was awarded the Society's Fredson Bowers Award, which is partly supported by a subvention from our sister organization, the Bibliographical Society of America. And this enabled her to continue her work in New Directions, looking at American and British book and translation programs targeting Italy from the Second World War to the Cold War, and involved a trip to the States to do some research, which I hope we'll hear about today. And her talk this evening will have the title Italian Readers, American Books and the Second World War, Propaganda and Publishing History in the Archive. So welcome, Dr. Lanfranchi.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and I'd like to thank the Bibliographical Society and the Bibliographical Society of America for the generous support that allowed me to start this project, which I am very happy to briefly introduce to you all today. We dedicated research time at the National Archives in College Park, the Library of Congress, and the Mood Library in Princeton. On the 6th of March 1945, a long-range operational plan for Italy was drafted to outline the aims and the strategies that Office of War Information would follow in its activities in the Italian theatre. Long-range directives and operational plans for the country had already been issued over the autumn of 1944. They were periodically reviewed following military developments as new areas of the Italian territory were liberated from the German occupation first, and from the Italian Social Republic later. In March, the end of the hostilities in Europe was in sight, although the war in the Pacific would continue for several months. Italy was just over a month away from the Allied spring offensive, which ultimately led to the national insurrection of the 25th of April and to the German surrender 4 days later. Within this context, this plan is particularly interesting as it reflects the awareness that the end of the war would bring changes to the nature of the Office of War Information activity in the area. The agency, created in June 1942 from the reorganization of pre-existing bureaus, represented the key American propaganda agency in the Second World War, which produced and distributed information through a variety of media, both on the home front and overseas. Collaborating with allied agencies, the Office of War Information have taken a keen interest in the use of the printed word to support the war effort. As research has demonstrated, the contribution of professionals with background in publishing and journalism and the collaboration with the non-profit organization of American book publisher, the Council of Books in Wartime, were pivotal in planning, production, and distribution of their material. Ranging from leaflet to booklets, general and specialized periodicals, and paperback series. In this, and I quote, guidance now valid for the liberated Italy, and that can be extended to apply to occupied Italy as the largest cities are freed, it is noted how much of the material prepared in the past, in a psychological vacuum, when we were out of touch with our audience, has been found unsuitable in content or in presentation. From now on, tell us the document, we will be dealing with informational and not propagandistic material. This fact has especial importance for Italy, which shares the general European hostility to propaganda, exasperated by the conviction that Italians in particular have been misled by propaganda in the past. After 20 years of fascist rule, information, not propaganda, was the way forward. The nature of this distinction had been the source of debate across allied information and propaganda agency, and while I do not have the space today to discuss this further, it will also continue to inform different views and projects for the post-war era. From our book historical point of view, however, in making this distinction, the plan provides us with a snapshot of past, present, and future publishing outputs of the Office of War Information. Alongside radio communication, feature films, and photo exhibits, periodical, booklets, book and publication rights are considered here of crucial importance to both inform and influence, as we will see, a variety of Italian reading communities. First, the Office of War Information had been producing and distributing, usually at a relatively low price but not for free, a number of periodicals, including miniature edition in several languages. Back numbers of Office of War Information periodical should be now available for reference at the Information Center, but are not recommended for general distribution. Periodicals, it continues, should be edited increasingly with an eye to higher informational content, read variety, and freedom in the handling of topics. Items recommended for Italy included USA. You can see here a few miniature editions in different languages that for the future should cover especially topics such as American democracy in action, the history of the war, achievements in science and thought since 1939, American policy role in the post-war world, and in particular, relations with Italy and American views on Italy. Other titles mentioned are Victory and Il Mondo Libero. Not mentioned here, but surviving at the National Archives, are also specialized bulletins on agriculture, engineering, industry, and education that were printed locally in Italy. A second category was that of booklets, which should continue to be sold through the Information Center and other appropriate outlets. Those of an informational character should receive high priority in distribution. The selection would privilege material providing information that could not otherwise be available in Italy, in particular of historical nature, as well as material of scientific, literary, and artistic value. In the new period, adds the writer, and this was probably Wallace Carroll, the deputy director of Area 1 of Overseas Operation, naked propaganda about the men of our armed forces is likely to be found offensive. This means that we should withdraw booklets as these are the US fighting men, Whigs of America, Medal of Honor. Another example of this type of material is US aircraft carriers, of which you see several copies in the Italian language. A similar treatment was probably to be reserved to items previously produced that were specifically targeting readers in Sicily, who had been the first to be addressed. To be kept instead were materials highlighting historical relation between Italy and the United States, as well as the Italo-American community. An example is the illustrated series on Anglo-American artists, and you see here a few copies. While booklets might still be used for exhibitions, speeches, and official documents, more example here on the light brown cover, the Office of War Information was planning to move away from this format. It is generally agreed that in the future, booklets might not be an ideal medium for informational services, largely because their appearances evoke memories of the propaganda handouts to which Europeans are averse. Whenever possible, we should use books in the future to give more solid treatment to subjects which have in the past been treated in booklets. And here we arrive to the third and more lasting format, volume publication. In the US, the Office of War Information was working with the Council on Books in Wartime to publish the Overseas Edition series. As John Hench has meticulously reconstructed, its titles were chosen from wartime catalog of trade publishers that were not yet available in Europe, and were published as paperback either in English original or in French, German, or Italian translation. A sister series, the Transatlantic Edition, was also published in London in French and Dutch. 5 books have been or are being prepared for distribution in Italy. These 5 books are American High Command Reports, Bene America, Into the Valley by John Hersey, Citizen Tom Paine by Howard Fast, and The Human Comedy by William Saroyan. Here, the Library of Congress and the Consular Archives in Princeton take us through the design, translation, editing, composition, and print of these books. Their aim was to prepare Italian readers as the wave of translation that Italian publishers would print once able to restart their activities was in sight. This reprise, however, was already underway in March 1945. Meanwhile, it is recognized, Italian publishers are already seeking to revive their activities and are displaying great eagerness to obtain American books. We are for the present in an advantageous position in that we can be of material assistance to this publisher, and at the same time, we can influence their choices away from less desirable and towards more desirable books. And here the tension between informing and influencing, between information and propaganda, reappears. This power of influence, however, should be exercised with great forbearance. The New York Review Board, again, the Office of War Information, declined to sanction a selection of Abel Ferradano and A Walk in the Sun as 2 of the 5 books in the Overseas Edition. However, there is no reason why we should not help an Italian publisher who wishes to bring out Italian version of this novel as private publishing enterprise. In such cases, our role should be confined to supervising the elimination of offensive passages. Even this censor's task should be kept to a minimum. In general, it might be said that Italian requests for copyright clearances should be granted liberally, excluding only those books which are one-sided or malicious in their treatment of the United States or the United Nations. As several Italian publishers had branches in Rome, Italian translation programs featuring Anglo-American works had indeed restarted as early as the summer of 1944. In the chaos following the liberation of the Italian capital, both US and British authorities were supporting such activities through copyright clearances and paper allocation. In the American case, Italian publisher archives inform us that copyright work to facilitate translation was carried out primarily by the press office of the American Embassy and by local posts of the United States Information Services. In 1946, the task would be passed on to the short-lived United States International Book Association. While at the central level, the line between information and influence was ever more blurred, as we briefly see today, Italian publishers were also active participants in such programs. Their requests reflected intellectual and political instances on the backdrop of rapidly changing social and cultural landscapes. Further exploration of the dialectic exchange between information agency and the Italian book trade will constitute the next phase of this project, together with the transformation of book translation programs for the early Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for you later. But now we shall move on to our second speaker, Anouska Lester, who may be known to some of you as the recently appointed Programme Development Manager here at the Society of Antiquaries. She's also an Honorary Research Associate at the University of York, and her PhD, which she undertook at Roehampton University, examined lost 16th century props and costumes and the nature of the early modern performance archive. And she's now looking at the history of collecting in York and in Stratford-upon-Avon, among many other things. She's the co-editor with Martin Wiggins of Marlowe and Nash's Dido, Queen of Carthage, for the recent edition in the Oxford Marlowe project. And her first monograph, Lost Texts and Performance Paleontology, a wonderfully intriguing title, will be published in due course with Cambridge University Press. So certainly I'm intrigued by a book with a title including Lost Texts and Performance Paleontology. Her work, funded by the Bibliographical Society, concerned the library of William and Silvester Petyt in Skipton and in the Inner Temple. And so without further ado, please really welcome Anouska Lester to tell us about this library.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction and for the support, which has enabled me to start a project that's looking at this 18th century library in Skipton in Yorkshire, and looking at some of the ways that the regional library connects up with the central library in London. I also want to thank some of my colleagues at the University of York. So while my specific project is looking at the catalogues of the library, it's part of wider work that I've benefited from with Sarah Griffin, Hannah Jeans, and Mark Jenner at York. So what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of an overview of what this library is, just in case you hadn't heard of the Petyts. I hadn't until about 18 months ago. And then I'll go through my specific project looking at the catalogues. Now, I'll be honest, I have been looking at this library for, as I say, about 18 months. I've been working on the catalogue specifically since getting this grant. I have a lot more questions than I have answers at this stage. So I'm intrigued to hear what you think of the questions that I've come up with. But just to warn you, this will be ending with more questions than sort of established facts. So William and Silvester Petyt are two brothers who were born in Skipton in Yorkshire, and they both moved to London and study at the Inns of Court and become barristers. William Petyt, pictured here, also becomes Keeper of Records at the Tower of London. And in his time, he collects a huge mass of archives, manuscripts, printed books. And he, together with his brother, amasses this huge collection. And William dies in 1707, And in his will, he specifies what he'd like to be done with this huge collection. He says, and as for and concerning my manuscripts and printed books of law, history, antiquity, and parliamentary proceedings, which cost me many years, pains, and study, and stood me in much charge in collecting, I give and devise them to my trustees, to the intent and purpose that they would use their utmost endeavours for preserving and keeping them safe and entire for public use. So he doesn't specify quite where his books and manuscripts are going to go, but he does leave money to Inner Temple, to Skipton, and to Middle Temple for provision of creating libraries there. And he leaves it up to his trustees to decide what it is and what will go where. And his manuscripts mostly end up at Inner Temple. And Adrian Blunt writes that the library's existence at Inner Temple is first documented in 1505, but the Petyt bequest of 1707, with the direct and indirect consequences that followed over the next few years, was arguably the single most important development in its subsequent history. The Petyt collection in Inner Temple is vast. And so the importance of Petyt's collection at Inner Temple and also at Middle Temple is quite established. But what we didn't know quite so much about was this collection in Skipton. So what happened was the librarian at the University of York, based at the Borthwick Institute, Sarah Griffin, found out in 2018 that Skipton Parish Town Council and the grammar school, Stead's Grammar School in Skipton, had this vast collection of, they said, 2,500 early printed books, and they didn't have anywhere that they could store them safely. And so Sarah said, I have a library, I have an archive, can we help? And so they've come to an arrangement now where that collection is on a 25-year deposit with the University of York. It was initially thought there was 2,500 volumes. It's now thought to be closer to 4,500. And thanks to ESTC, York were able to immediately upload all of the information about the books in that collection. And you can see that on the university, on your search, and you can see there's 4,600 results that come up when you put in the Petyt collection. And just to give you sort of a very brief idea of what that ESTC data gives us and the kind of collection this is, created a word cloud for you. So we have a lot of church history, we have controversial Catholic literature, we have a lot of literature on the Civil War, but there's also, it's a vast and varied collections. There are references to science, to performance, to art, to literature and culture. And the collection was housed in two different areas in Skipton. It was housed in the parish church and it was housed in the school. So these were books that would be thought useful to each of those audiences. So for instance, there are a lot of Latin and Greek grammars, for instance, that go to the school. So that's sort of an overview of the collection. What I've specifically been working on is the catalogues, because what makes this collection to me quite extraordinary is not only do we have these 4,500 volumes, we also have the 18th century catalogues of when these books were sent up following William Petyt's death to Skipton. So here we go. We've got catalogues in 2 volumes. Precisely what those volumes are and what they're doing is one of the questions that I am still trying to figure out. But for now, 2 volumes, folio-sized, of catalogues created at the beginning of the 18th century. We also have catalogues from 1843, from 1914, and then we obviously have the most recent ESTC data. So we can track this library's history, how it changes over time, what's acquired, what's lost, from the 1700s right up to the present day. And I've been working mostly with the 18th century catalogues. And the sense that I get from those is that this is a really collaborative endeavour. So here, for example, we've got an extract where Mr. Petyt hath sent 17 volumes of quarto miscellanies only stitched, which are not catalogued, but hopes that Mr. Timothy Banks will, as he promised, take care that they shall be catalogued. So perhaps this is something that is being sent up from London, and normally they're cataloguing everything in London, but on this occasion they've got some things where, because they are just stitched, maybe it went up at the last minute. For whatever reason, they weren't catalogued in London. So they're relying on someone, maybe someone in Skipton, to complete that cataloguing. And then we have Mr. Timothy Banks, whom I assume is the person who writes after this, in the next page being the catalogue of the aforesaid 17 volumes. And here we go, Mr. Timothy Banks, truly some of the most atrocious handwriting that I have seen. So there are a few different names that are mentioned in the catalogues where you get a sense of lots of people working together to create these libraries in Skipton. There's also just some useful data from the catalogues about what was going on when. So we think that most of the books were sent up in 1707, and then you see there are irregular shipments up until 1715. We also, because we have those original catalogues, we know what has survived and what hasn't. So this is approximate because we've had 10 amazing research assistants and interns who've been bringing this data together, but there's still some more work to be done in sort of tidying up that data. But at this stage, we think that 75% or 74% of those books that were sent up in the early 18th century have survived and now at the University of York. And we have the names, the titles of a further 26% which have not survived. And I've picked out one example. So this is a map from 1646, which actually, because the school in Skipton where some of these books were sent is still in operation, it's Ermisted's Grammar School, we have some stories about what had happened to some of these books. So apparently this map is one of the maps that was just absolutely ruined by the schoolboys, and it was just used to death. So we have the title and we have that story, but we don't have the volume itself. We can also tell from the catalogues where these books were ending up. So the majority were going to the church, some were also going to the school, some, the catalogues seem to say, are going to, they've got whole lists that are for the church and school, and it's not quite clear which are ending up where. We can also use the catalogues to reconstruct some of the Sammelbands that were sent up to Skipton, because there was a rebinding project in the 1950s where all of the Sammelbands were unpicked and we lost a lot of contextual information. But because we have the 18th century catalogues, there is a future project where we could reconstruct what those Sammelbands originally looked like. So this one, for example, is from July 1708, and there were 23 items that were all bound together. So in terms of how the books were acquired, some of them, it seems that they were William and Silvester's own books. Some of them were purchased specifically because they were thought to be useful for the church or the school. So here we have an example where William Petyt has written on the title page his name and the Petyt motto, qui s'estime petit deviendra grand, which I think is incredibly cheeky because you've got the pun on petit and Petyt on Petyt. So whoever thinks himself small or Petyt will find himself grand. There's more evidence for this collaboration in terms of how the books were acquired. So here we have a list which is towards the augmentation of the library of Mr. Silvester Petyt, erected in the Church of Skipton. Mr. Christopher Bateman of Paternoster Row, citizen stationer, and of the Common Council of London, and one of the most eminent booksellers in England, hath given the following books. And Mr. Bateman also paid for the carriage of his books. So you also have a bookseller who is collaborating in sending books to Skipton and working with Silvester Petyt to do so. Christopher Bateman was also from Skipton. So the regional network that they had established then continued when they moved to London, but still benefited their hometown. There's more evidence of Christopher Bateman. So we have an entry for the Bible and this Testament want title pages. And to supply these defects, search has been made in the library at St. Paul's and in the library of Gresham Crossed-out Sion College in London amongst the ancient Bibles and Testaments there, but none of these editions are there to be found. And also inquiry has been made of Mr. Christopher Bateman and of one of the greatest booksellers in London and very well acquainted with these old books and their editions, but he has them not. Now, this is one of the books that we think that we don't have But I wonder if, because it lacks a title page, if it's something that will have been missed out of the catalogue. It's something I've found a couple of times with the catalogues, that obviously because we're lacking that data, then we don't know that the book has survived. So there's more work to be done in hunting these down. But mostly, I find this fascinating for showing, again, how collaborative this is, but also thinking about the role of these catalogues. It's not just a list of books. It's not just an inventory. It's also giving a bit of a narrative of the work that's being done to put this library together. We also get an insight, this is where I get excited because I'm a cataloguing nerd, into the potential original cataloguing of the library. So here we have works of Sir William Davenant, which Silvester Petyt has written for the church library, number 1118, for the use of the parish of Skipton by me, Silvester Petyt. And you can see we've got the 1843 catalogue at the bottom there, also calls this book 1118, and you'll see a later hand as added to the 18th century catalogue 1118. So this is one of my big questions, is does Silvester Petyt and his collaborators, are they deciding on a cataloguing arrangement that is then implemented in Skipton? What level of agency do they have in creating this collection? Is it just William had all of these books, we're going to send them up to Skipton, to the church and the library and the school library, and they'll sort them out there? In fact, the catalogue suggests that there was a lot more investment on the part of Silvester Petyt and his collaborators to really intentionally create a library that was well organised and that was going to be useful. We also get a bit of sense of maybe what these books might have been used for. So here we have a copy of Piratus Romana et Parisiensis. This is a distressingly clean copy. There is very little in terms of annotation. There is just a little bit I picked out there in the contents. So in terms of understanding how this book was used, the copy itself doesn't give us very much information. However, in the catalogue, you'll see a little note there for this book. This book may be read by all charitably disposed ladies and gentlewomen. So Silvester and whoever he's working with are aware that there are potential female readers who will be also using this parish church library, and they're selecting books that might be specifically useful for them, which I think, again, gives us an insight into the methods that Silvester and his collaborators are using, and also potentially who is using this library up in Skipton. I just want to end by drawing back to the Inner Temple collection, because one of the things that this grant enabled me to do was to go to Inner Temple, where I knew that there were also some manuscript catalogues from the 18th century. So I turn up at the Inner Temple, very excited, and I have these catalogues, and I open it up, and I see a hand that I have been working with for hundreds of hours. So there we have the first image is the Inner Temple catalogue. The second image is the Skipton catalogue. It's the same hand, and I don't know who that hand is, but that gives me an insight into the fact that this is one whole endeavour of deciding where the books go. Are they going to Inner Temple? Are they going to Middle Temple? Are they going to Skipton? And it's centralised. It's also, the paper has the same watermark. So that's an Arms of Amsterdam watermark from the early 18th century. So to give you a sense of, some of the treasures in the collection, this is a collage that Sarah Griffin has put together. As I say, I'm left with more questions about who was using this library, who put it together, but it really seems like it's an extraordinarily vast and varied collection, and it seems that there's a real agency and care that was taken over where these different books ended up. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you especially for including that photo at the end of an 18th century watermark, which links us very nicely into our final presentation this evening. which will be given by Dr. Silvia Pugliese, who has been in charge of the preservation and conservation at the Marciana in Venice since 2015, where she's worked since 1999. She holds a PhD in Bibliographical and Archival Sciences from the University of Udine, and also holds degrees from Bologna and Spoleto, where she trained as a paper conservator. And as well as being a practicing conservator and with massive responsibilities for one of the great libraries of the world, she has undertaken research into paper production. And her talk this evening will be on paper production in the 18th century Venetian Republic through its use in large format prints and books. So Dr. Pugliese, please will you come up?
Thank you. Okay. So anybody studying paper production in the Venetian Republic in the 18th century consider 1768 as a watershed date, because in this date, the magistrates of the Cinque Savi alla Mercanzia and Inquisitore alla Carta were editing a publication, a terminazione, which was listing all the paper mills present in the Venetian territories at that date, and with the initials of the each paper maker. Before that date, it was often found to have both a watermark and a countermark in each sheet of paper, but after 1768, it was compulsory. So here we have a document dated 1759 with IP initial, which stands for Ignazio Parise, a paper maker near Vicenza, and two watermarks, rose and two keys crossed. And this, of course, is a document dated 59. So it was, of course, possible to have countermarks before 68. But after 68, they had to be the watermarks recorded to the magistrates of the Inquisitore alla Carta, which is sort of paper inquisitor, and Cinque Savi alla Mercanzia. And if a paper maker wanted to change his initial, he had to ask for permission. Ivo Mattozzi is an historian of economy and society who published in 1996 the complete list of the initials of paper makers, so the so-called countermarks. But what happens before 1768? We will study the case of 4 paper makers in particular. So please remember that in 1768, we had 105 paper mills, but 43 of these paper mills were located in Toscolano, which should go back here, which was located on the western shore of the Lake Garda between Bergamo and Brescia. There were 12 districts and 1 district in the whole of the Venetian territories, 12 paper districts, and 1 district was the Salò district. So it was devoted only to this little tiny area on the western shore of the Garda Lake. It was 40% of paper mills, but if we consider large format paper, it was almost the total of large format production, with some exceptions, which are still very interesting to study. In this case, we will study 3 paper makers from the Garda Lake, which are Zuanelli, Seguito, and Girardi. Limone, here you can see Pietro Giuseppe Gerardi Salò. In fact, it was not from Salò, but it was from Limone, which is a tiny village south of Salò, but anyway, always on the Garda Lake. And then I added a 4th paper maker, which is Francesco Basso from Vacile near Treviso, just to show the difference. So So if we go before 1768, because it's easy to go after 1768 because we have this list, but if we go before, the questions are more interesting to understand and to study. I chose an example of large, very, very large format, as the subject of my presentation was large format. So I chose the largest format I could find, and it is related to the consul Joseph Smith. So it was significant for me also to present it here because his collection ended up in George III library collection. In this case, it's edition, it's a book preserved in the Vatican Library in Rome, in the Fondo Cicognara. Cicognara is a Venetian name. He was a Venetian collector, and his library ended up in the Vatican Library in 1824. This book is still in its original binding, which is a poor binding. And it's exceptional in its for two things. One, the dimensions, and second, the fact that the prints contained in this book are still all together. We have many copies, but a number of copies of these prints preserved in many libraries. Even here in London, I found them in the British Museum Catalogue of Prints. But a few libraries hold an exemplar with all the prints together. The Vatican Library has one more significant feature. It has two title pages. One is the title page of the edition of the monochromata. So there are 7 prints engraved by Lyotard, Jean-Michel Lyotard, a Swiss engraver. And one is another title page, but with no content inside, of prints engraved again by Lyotard after some paintings by Sebastiano Ricci. So this edition was put together with 2 title pages, 2 portraits, one by Sebastiano Ricci and one by Carlo Cignani, but only 7 engravings from Cignani. The engravings were engraved by Lyotard at Consul Smith's home in Venice, where Lyotard was staying for years, and they were engraving some preparatory drawings made by Cignani for the Palazzo del Giardino in Parma. These drawings are kept in Hampton Court, so it's still here the origin of this work. These pictures I took from the Princeton Library has digitized all the microfiche of the Fondo Cicognara. So it's very easy and interesting to study all this collection. Anyway, where is it? Yes. So if we look at the title page and the portrait of Sebastiano Ricci, we find a watermark which is very common in large format prints of the 18th century. It's a crossbow as a watermark and a Z as countermark. And it is the Zuanelli paper mill, which was one of the best quality paper possible in the Venetian Republic. Please note that when we talk about Zuanelli, we say that he was a paper maker, but actually he was a merchant. So all these big names, which we find as countermark, are not the names of the real paper makers, but are the names of the merchants selling the paper. Of course, they were not selling the paper directly in Venice. They were selling them to intermediaries, which were bringing their paper in Venice. So if we see at these sheets, the measures are the same. So it's around more than 500 millimeters by more than 700 millimeters in both cases. But the measures of the watermarks are different. And this is because the printer was choosing 2 different formats of paper. One was the Sotto Imperiale, which we can translate like a sub-imperial format for the title page, and one, which was for the engraving, was the best quality paper ever possible, the imperial quality, even if it was meant to be cut as a Sotto Imperiale. So this means that the engraver was very, very conscious of the quality of papers available, and that Smith was choosing the best quality paper for the best result he wanted to achieve. We can say that the format was different just by judging the measurement of the watermarks, of the distance between the chain lines, and of the spacing between the laid lines, and even from the general thickness of the paper. But the general thickness is something which we can very rarely measure, while we can measure the other the other quantities. This is something which everybody can do. If we go to the Gabinetto of Print Cabinet of Carezzonico, an institution in Venice, we find other examples of leotard prints, but they are not keeping their original dimensions. They are cut only to keep the print, but we can find a variation in watermark. In this case, the watermark point us to Antonio Seguito. F stands for Francesco, which was the brother of Antonio Seguito and who was the actual merchant selling the paper. So we have two variations. So that means that Consul Smith was getting paper from two different paper makers. If we move to three prints in the same edition, which are a double page print, we see that their measures are over the maximum measured possible in standard paper production. The measures are more than 730 millimeters by 910 millimeters, which means something like this as a sheet, which makes us wondering how the paper maker could handle the mold, because it was something like this. So maybe there were two people working together. And these were for sure papers made on commission by Consul Smith, because this kind of production was an exceptional production. So this means that Consul Smith was also ordering a special measure paper to Zuanelli against, because even in this case we have Zuanelli watermark. I put here the measures which were standardized in 1774 in the Venetian Republic. So as you see, the maximum was 551 by 703. This is almost the double of an imperial format. If we look at the watermarks, we have again an exceptional presence of an extremely large watermark. It's it's almost half it's almost an A3 size, and it's sewn on 4 chain lines, and the distance between the chain lines is very large. So it means that I don't know why the paper maker wanted this very spaced chain lines, maybe because it didn't want to have too much a heavy mold to keep on. This is something I still have to understand. If we look at the countermark, actually there are 2 countermarks. One is the crossbow. So if we go back here, we see that there are 2 crossbow with a single line. One is small and one is larger. If we go here, we see the same crossbow, but it is traced, it is sewn with a double line, which is quite difficult to sew for us for a watermark sewer. It would have been quite difficult to do it. And it's also very large. And this again says us that it was a production made just for this kind of edition. I haven't found another edition, sorry, bringing this kind of watermark. I will look for it. In this edition, Consul Smith was therefore choosing 4 different quality of papers. One was a Sotto Imperiale for the title page. One was the Imperiale for the portraits and for the prints, which had a 1 sheet size. One was a variant, so the Antonio Seguito variation, and one was the exceptional, I call it XXL paper size, which was for the 3 big prints. Here I present you another case of an edition made with an imperial paper for an in-folio edition. So there was no need to ask for an imperial paper, but the editor was again looking for the best quality paper. In this case, the editor was not Pasquali, who was the editor of Consul Smith, but was Albrizzi, and the author was Antonio Maria Zanetti, who was another collector in Venice. So again, we find here the Z of Zuanelli, the crossbow from Zuanelli again, and if we look at the measurement, we see that the chain lines are horizontal, which is not possible in an in-folio edition. We should have the chain lines vertical. So this is the first alarm sounding to us that it is not a normal paper production. Then the dimensions of the watermark and of the countermark. If we compare it with another edition made in 1740 in Venice with the same Zuanelli paper, so the same crossbow, the same watermark, and even a larger size, a folio with a larger size, we see that in this case, the editor, which was Simone Occhi, was choosing a normal Zuanelli paper intended for book. In the list of paper production made by paper makers, they always list the first 5 qualities like imperiale, sottoimperiale, reale, etc., and then book paper for books. So they had very clear this distinction between paper for luxurious production, so prints, and paper just for books. We see also that the difference in dimensions for the same watermark of the crossbow. We know from the letters written by Zanetti to Anton Francesco Gori in Venice that he was asking especially to Zuanelli this kind of paper. So he was writing, and we have to note that on the title page, it is written that the editor is Albrizzi, but the edition is at the author's expenses. So Zanetti was paying for the paper itself. So he writes to Anton Francesco Gori in 47 and 48, 2 years before the edition took place, that he was waiting from Zuanelli, from Stefano Zuanelli in Toscolano. So Toscolano was the main center of this Garda Lake district. He was waiting from Toscolano, from Stefano Zuanelli, the better quality paper. And he wanted to wait because he knew that the best quality and the finest paper was coming from Zuanelli. And then he also complains that Zuanelli is particularly slow in sending him the paper. So eventually in January 1748, Zuanelli has sent him the paper, and Zanetti says that he paid the paper a lot of money. This information, I found this information in a degree thesis by Valentina Brustolozzi made in 2013-2014. Smith also made an edition of his gem collection, as Zanetti did in 1750, Smith did in 1767. And he again used, even if the format of the book was in folio, he again used some imperial or sub-imperial paper size. We can understand it because again, the chain lines are horizontal. In this case, the paper maker had was not Zuanelli, who was one of the most favorite paper makers for Venetian printers, but was Pietro Girardi. His countermark was PGG, the 2G are mirrored with a dove on top of it and the 3 moons. We have to be careful because when we find the 3 moons as a watermark, it doesn't mean that the paper is a 3 moons size. The 3 moons could be found in every kind of paper, from imperial to 3 moons, but the 3 moons paper itself was a very, let's say, poor quality, was the lowest quality among the luxurious quality paper. So in this case, we have an imperial or a sub-imperial as well. The Venice State Archives keep a huge collection of documents regarding all the paper production, because all the paper makers had to send to Venice the documentation and the reports about their production, and it was a regular form of exchange between the central administration and the peripheral administration. So we can study in many different funds of the state archives the documentation. This is the declaration which Pietro Girardi was sending to Venice about his countermark. So when the magistrates were preparing the report I showed at the beginning of my presentation, the 68 Terminazione, it was based on all the reports that all the paper makers were sending to Venice. And all this report had a drawing of their countermarks. So in this case, we see the DAV, the P, and the 2G. I also put another document dated from the 80s of the century, where again we found the PGG and the 3 heads. The 3 heads is a watermark which was used especially in writing letters. So it was not a especially luxurious paper. And this is another report dated 1765, where Girardi is a 3 pages report. And in this picture, I just put some of the information he gives, which are the prices. So for the imperial and the sub-imperial, it's 10 liras and 15 soldi by weight. So it's not measured by reams, but by weight, the most important paper. How many mills he had, how many wheels he had, which was his production, 80 balloons of paper, and the majority of this paper was sent to Venice. And sending to Venice means sending it to printers in Venice and to the Ottoman market, so all over the Mediterranean. So that's why we can find papers from Girardi and from Zuanelli and from Antonio Seguito all over the Mediterranean, because they were merchants sending their production outside the Toscolano and the Lake Garda area. Yes, I finished. That's the last one. I put 2 examples to show the difference between a Toscolano paper and a non-Toscolano paper. These are 2 editions made by Giambattista Pasquali in 49. You can see just for the pictures the difference. So here we have again our Zuanelli. And here we have the non-Zuanelli one, which is Vacile, and it's a paper mill near Treviso. Again, we have another one in Toscolano, so GFS, and we see that it's again a good quality paper. And to end up, I put 2 pictures of the 2 rivers where the paper mills were located. So the Toscolano River was a river in the mountains with a very deep, how do you say? It was a very deep river, while the Mignagola River, which was near Treviso, was a flat river, and it was getting its water from resurgences. So it was a completely different environment where paper were done. And so this is why the paper were so different. I'm sorry if I've been too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvia Pugliese, for that really fascinating overview of some books that have, I think, generally been neglected by some of those who prefer to work on very early watermarks, but it's a completely different thing. Now, we have maybe just a few minutes for questions because we're overrunning very slightly, although actually all 3 of you kept time very well, so thank you for that. Are there any questions in the audience? I have plenty of questions for everybody. But maybe because we only have a few minutes, I mean, I do want to ask Anouska lots of questions. But one of them is simply that you said that there were 4,604 or whatever books, the records for which could be derived from ESTC. I wondered, are there other books, other books published abroad, books in Latin, books books that are unrecorded in the STC, but English books. Are there other rarities that have been found in that project of working through the library in Skipton? And maybe I should have asked, actually, I wondered if all three speakers could come up to the front as well, please.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I might have misspoke because that was before I became on the project, so I'm not entirely sure where I might have misspoken in terms of where that data came from. But there are, I mean, there certainly are several not English books, several international books, particularly that get sent to the school. So there are a lot of language books to help the boys with their learning of their languages. And that in terms of the survival rate of the books, it's those particular books that don't survive as well because they're just getting so much use. So that doesn't quite answer your question, but yes, there are lots of different books, not just the English ones.
Yes, I sort of assumed that given the range of subjects, that would be necessary. Now I know we have one question on Zoom. Oh, do you have a question as well? Yes, Christian.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Anne Lanfranchi a question if I can. I wonder if you had an opportunity to compare the US approach to dealing with publishing in Italy with the approach in, say, Austria and Germany, and to some extent also in France.
Thank you very much for this question. Of course, I look at the kind of bilateral exchange there, and they will look at Italy specifically. There were policy specifically targeting Germany and Austria, and with the difference between the two contexts, they were not treated, German-speaking population were not addressed in the same way. There is a key difference that has to do with the perception that the American military had with regard to the responsibility for the war. And therefore, the treatment, especially of German soldiers and German population, was significantly different to that of the Italian population, especially after the 8th September 1943. So there are key differences there, although I'm not a German specialist. In general, the idea was that in Italy, there was American trying to make a much more clear distinction between the Italian population and the fascist regime. They weren't seen as one thing. Differently was done in Germany and to a degree in Austria. And overall, Italian people were seen as less educated and less able to formulate ideas for themselves. And therefore, this information needed to be guided through, apart from a very small minority of intellectuals. So yeah, there were key differences, and even more difference with Japan or East Asian people. And there is really a great degree of attention in targeting different population, different reading communities within those population.
Thank you. Now we have one question, at least one question from our online audience.
And it regards watermarks, so I assume it's for Silvia. Is there a global catalog of all watermarks? Specifically, is there a catalog for the Venetian collection? And does it include paper type as part of its metadata?
If I understood, if there is a catalog of Venetian papers, is it? No. Especially for Venetian papers of the 18th century. But there is this catalog of watermarks by Mattozzi, which is very helpful. And it's, I showed it, it goes by, it lists the letters, so it's very easy to find, where is it? Here it is. It's very easy to find a countermark. It goes by letter, so it's in alphabetical order. The problem is before 1768, because often the same letters are found before that date, but not all of them.
Thank you. Were there any other questions online or from the room? Well, I know I have other questions, but I think I would rather ask them personally, because that will allow the audience, at least the audience in the room, to join us for a glass of wine afterwards, but not before we've thanked again our speakers this evening. So thank you again. Well, thank you.